Thank you for joining us today for the second annual keynote lecture of the MSU Foglio Speaker Series on Spirituality. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Adawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Additionally, I would like to thank today's co-sponsors, the Center for Integrative Studies in the Arts and Humanities, the College of Arts and Letters, the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Religious Studies, Peace and Justice Studies, and the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel. Initiated in honor of Father Jake Foglio, an alumnus, former faculty member, and longtime priest and mentor to countless MSU student athletes and coaches, the MSU Foglio Speaker Series on Spirituality offers the opportunity to explore the manifold meanings and applications of spirituality in the contemporary world through lectures, talks, workshops, and experiential events. The series aims to cultivate greater awareness of and appreciation for the many ways spirituality manifests across global religious cultures, interacts with public life, and emerges as a secular orientation for pursuing meaning, purpose, and belongingness. In addition to an annual keynote, the speaker series includes a yearly faculty lecture to be delivered this spring in relation to Earth Day by Professor Gretel van Wieren, as well as events and talks dedicated to highlighting the connection between spirituality, social justice, and diversity, equity, and inclusivity. More information about our spring events will be announced later this semester. Establish to advance Father Jake's commitment to others, to the academic study of human spirit, in relation to his efforts to expand understanding of spirituality beyond strictly religious concerns to the myriad ways humans seek meaning and define what matters most in their lives and in their communities, I could not be more thrilled to introduce today's keynote lecturer, Professor Roger S. Gottlieb. Professor Gottlieb has played an instrumental role in not only advancing the study of spirituality and environmentalism, and in all honesty, my work as well. I'm currently using two of his texts in both my classes and a project I'm working on, but also, much like Father Jake, expanding our frames of reference and understanding of spirituality into everyday life. The William B. Smith Dean's Professor of Philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, Dr. Gottlieb is the author or editor of 21 books and over 150 articles on political philosophy, contemporary spirituality, religious environmentalism, environmental ethics, religious studies, the Holocaust, and disability. He is internationally known for his work as a leading analyst and exponent of religious environmentalism, for his passionate and moving account of spirituality in an age of environmental crisis, and for his innovative and humane description of the role of religion in a democratic society. He's given keynote addresses and endowed lectures at universities and public settings in the US and Canada. His two works of fiction, The Sacrifice Zone and Engaging Voices, received Nautilus Book Awards, as did Spirituality, What It Is and Why It Matters. His recent work in environmental ethics, morality, and the environmental crisis was called The Book Most Likely to Save the Planet by Independent Publisher Magazine. In today's lecture, Professor Gottlieb will challenge us to confront the realities facing our environmental moment. As he provocatively writes in the abstract of today's talk, quote, "For millennia, people have turned to the natural world for spiritual inspiration, emotional solace, and wisdom. Nature has given us joy, awed us, and served as a sheltering presence in times of depression, grief, and fear. But now all the earth has been darkened by human power, greed, and consumption. When nature arouses grief as well as awe, a victim as well as a sheltering presence, something we are anxious about as well as something that soothes our fears, how is our experience of nature profoundly altered?" A Q&A session, for which I'll act as moderator, will follow the talk. Please feel free to use the Zoom features to post questions during or after the talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roger S. Gottlieb. Thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you, everybody, for showing up. I hope you'll indulge me. I begin by ringing this bell. And I invite you to sit up wherever you are and let your eyes gently close. And focus your attention on your breath, the rise and fall of your chest, or the place at the base of the nose where breath enters the body. Wherever you've been, wherever you're going, if you focus on the breath, you come into the present moment, because you can only breathe in the present. And now let us begin. I will start with two quotations which will reappear in terms of their significance throughout the talk. The first goes like this: before we knew where the gods were, they were in the trees. Now there are no more trees. That's from the Raji, or indigenous tribe in Nepal. That was 25 years ago. From considerably longer ago, from the diary of Anne Frank, while she was hiding in an attic to avoid being murdered by the Nazis, which is what happened to her later. The best remedy, wrote Anne, the best remedy for those who are afraid, lonely, or unhappy is to go outside, somewhere where they can be quite alone with the heavens, nature, and God. Because only then does one feel all is as it is, and that God wishes to see people happy amidst the simple beauty of nature. As long as this exists, and it certainly always will, I know then there will always be comfort for every storm. I will talk about spirituality briefly, and I'll talk about nature spirituality. I'll talk about the environmental crisis, and then I'll ask what happens to nature spirituality after or during or in the middle of the environmental crisis. So to begin with, spirituality for me is a virtue theory, that is to say, a comprehensive theory of human psychology, which supposes that beings such as us, human beings, in order to be enduringly happy, to find peace of mind, to do well in life, need to live by certain virtues. These virtues don't guarantee happiness. After all, even if you're virtuous, even if you're spiritual in a concentration camp or a prison, you're not likely to feel too terrific. But whatever the external conditions of your life, living by spiritual virtues are likely to make you happier. Different writers on spirituality stress different virtues. For me, and this will appear later in the talk as well, the key spiritual virtues are awareness, acceptance, compassion, gratitude, and love. For a small taste of what spirituality has meant in religious tradition, consider the Talmud, that compendium of Jewish interpretation and law. The Talmud asks, who is rich? If you think in this political season of candidates debating, let's raise taxes on the rich. Who's rich? Who is rich, says the Talmud? The person who is satisfied with what they have. In Buddhism, original traditional Buddhist texts say that anger is like an illness. Whatever you're thinking of doing to somebody else, the anger that's rolling around inside you is like a poison. You should shun it. For a contemporary version of that, the Dalai Lama was once asked, what do you do with your anger at the Chinese, who after all took his homeland, tried to destroy his culture, so forth? He said, very simply, the Chinese have taken so much from me. I will not give them my peace of mind. Another example would be the contemporary Catholic writer, David Steindl-Rast, who wrote a book, the title of which was Gratitude is the Heart of Prayer. So awareness, restraint, appreciation, gratitude, virtues such as that don't guarantee that we'll be happy, that we'll be contented, but are most likely ways to get to anything like that, no matter what the setting in which we live. What then is nature spirituality? And how does it connect to the broad account of spirituality I've just given? Nature spirituality is a characteristic set of experiences, which may give rise to characteristic attitudes, and again, may lead to a certain way of living. In our encounter with the natural world, for example, we may find ourselves experiencing a whole series of states of mind which are supportive of spirituality. I'm going to just list some of those and describe each one in turn. So the first one is awe, a kind of reverential respect tinged with amazement and almost disbelief at the sheer scope and beauty of what we are witnessing. The enormity of oceans or glaciers, the subtle and ever-present interconnections of an ecosystem in which each part plays a role, even to the point of species that have co-evolved and trees that have complex exchange relationships with fungi. On a smaller scale, but still breathtakingly vast if you think about it, there are the remarkable abilities of the spider, whose webs are 5 times stronger microgram for microgram, 5 times stronger than steel. Or the eagle who can see a rabbit from 2 miles away, or dogs who can smell cancer and know when their human partners are going to have a seizure. On the one hand, this awe makes us, as the phrase is often used, feel small. That is, many of our common self-conceptions and personal concerns, the things that spirituality is meant to help us with, shrink in importance. On the other hand, our ability to sense the reality spread out before us enlarges our identity into something vast but refreshingly impersonal. Another thing that nature spirituality gives us is, often as a direct follow to awe, maybe the key spiritual virtue itself, of gratitude. That this magnificence has been given to us, that we need only walk out the door and it is there. Even if we live in the inner city, we can see weeds growing through the cracks in the sidewalk, notice pigeons or sparrows flocking, see the sunset colors enhanced by pollution. If a prison cell has a window, the prisoner can see the sun or a cloud or by chance a rainbow. What gifts we've been given. A key spiritual virtue, gratitude. People are a lot more fun to be around when they're grateful. Awe and gratitude may lead to a sense that we can be in communion, another feature of nature spirituality, a communion with a vast, inclusive, welcoming community. Some Native Americans begin a public statement or a story or a prayer with the phrase, "all my relations." They are not referring only to their aunts or sisters, but to the totality of living beings who surround them. How wonderful to be able to sense the living energy in the trees or the ants or the trout, to feel that we have all been graced with a chance to partake in the dance of life. How wonderful to feel that we are not alone, but surrounded by family wherever we look. You can go out to the woods by yourself, but you can't take a walk in the woods alone. You're surrounded by family. And all our actions must, in the form of love, another spiritual virtue, take seriously the needs and interests of that family, of all our relations, and not just of our individual selves. On the monotheistic side of things, nature is a gift from God. Quote, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." That's Psalm 24. The biblical notion is that the earth is and everything on it belongs to God, but that in deep love, God has given it to us to use. Some Jewish commentaries suggest that God, knowing what we are capable of, warned that if we despoil this earth, there won't be another. By implication, each part of the natural world is a unique creation of the ultimate creator. And thus daily life is a constant occasion for gratitude. Note, interestingly, the last line of the last Psalm, Psalm 150, calls, "Let everything that breathes praise God." Now, since no other life form can praise in any literal sense, what might this mean? Perhaps it means that each living being, each breath, should be taken by us as an occasion to praise God. All lives, we might say, matter, and mean not only the human ones. Nature spirituality often includes the sense that despite our collective human follies, something wondrous will continue no matter what we do. Whatever horrors we perpetuate on each other, the beautiful world will persist. It was this confidence that inspired Anne Frank. And indeed, at times, we might still look at a powerful rushing river and think, whatever happens to me, or my family, or indeed my country, this river will continue, and our fears for the future may well be soothed. Finally, and for me of greatest importance, nature spirituality includes the recognition of the countless individual beings, the trees and the trout and the frogs and the hawks, and large-scale systems, whole ecosystems, that function without an ego. Now, what do I mean by an ego? The word has a lot of different associations. Well, I try to explain this to my students by saying, go into your room, close the door, lock the door, take off all your clothes, stand in front of a mirror and look at yourself and see what thoughts arise. That's where the ego is. If it's not your body that you're so concerned with, then your grade point average, your bank account, how many people came to your birthday party, how fast you can run 5 miles, how many books you sold, whatever it is. The ego is the part of us that wants, that attaches, that gets desperate, that gets addicted, that hates ourselves, that's arrogant, all those kinds of things, none of which are going to produce any kind of happiness anytime soon. Somehow, nature functions without an ego. Consider a tree. Okay, big tree, stuck in the earth, holds onto the earth and prevents erosion, has an energy exchange with fungal networks underneath the earth via networks of bacteria so that they transform minerals back and forth, resources back and forth. It's a place for squirrels and birds and other animals that provide shade to human beings. This time of year, certainly where I live in Boston, the leaves are incredible change. Some trees flower in the spring. The tree does all this stuff despite all the energy it exerts. It doesn't exert one bit of energy trying to be better than some other tree, feeling resentful at the other trees, thinking it's not as good looking as the other trees, wishing desperately that it was located in a different part of the forest. It will put all its energy into living, but it won't put one bit of energy into fear that somebody's coming with a chainsaw to cut it down. Does all that without an ego. We go out into the forest and we experience all these beings doing these marvelous, incredible, spectacular things without an ego. And thus, we can see, yes, it's possible to get some sense of life without the ego. Okay, so we've done spirituality in general. We've done nature spirituality. Now, what is the environmental crisis? That's a long story. I'm sure many people here are aware of it, so I will just highlight a few of the features. Environmental crisis is the degradation of air, land, water, and bloodstreams. It's the fastest elimination of species in 70 million years. Rainforests that give off CO2 instead of taking it in. Permafrost, melting. 80% of the US now, today, under drought conditions. There's an average decline of animals of 70% in the last 50 years. Typical newborns in the US having 100 toxic chemicals in their bloodstreams. The environmental crisis is 6 million climate refugees and 3 to 6 million premature human deaths from air pollution each year. And the environmental crisis is that lurking fear that there will be more floods, more droughts, more destructive winds, and that with few exceptions, the pollution will only get worse. More of wild nature will die, and then, we fear, we'll follow the wars over immigration, over food, over water. I could go on, I often do. It's one reason people don't invite me to parties. I'm not the most cheerful person you're going to see. I'm sure you get the point. The central question we're going to deal with now is what then happens to nature's spirituality, to those experiences of awe and gratitude and comfort and the rest. Anne Frank goes out to be alone with God and nature and finds the beach covered with dead fish from algae blooms and covered with oil spills. She goes to the mountains and finds the earth ripped to pieces with mountaintop removal coal mines, toxic refuse filling the streams, the wildlife dead or scattered. She looks up at a tree in Mexico City and sees birds dropping dead from the unnatural heat. The Raji people no longer know where to find their gods, for the trees had all been cut down. What then was become of their worship? Monotheists who believe in non-physical God might smile at the Rajis' lack of theological sophistication. We know that God is not in the trees. But what would happen to the faiths we are sure are so much more advanced if every church and every synagogue were destroyed, and if every last copy of the Bible burned? Where then would we find God? The natural world can give rise to what Romain Rolland called the oceanic feeling, the emotional intuition of limitless connection to a reality of infinite size and scope. To those of us who have gazed at the ocean at sunrise, or camped by a secluded lake, or walked through a forest of old growth trees, that sense of connection to something eternal and essentially invulnerable may be familiar. Yet it is precisely this oceanic intuition and the spiritual comfort and balance to which it can give rise that the environmental crisis renders, if not impossible, then far more complex, troubled, and doubtful than ever before in human history. Like the Raji search for their gods, like Anne Frank's search for certain comfort, what we are connected to when we connect to nature has been irrevocably darkened. Author Bill McKibben, environmentalist and author, argued more than 3 decades ago that we have lost the sense of nature as a realm independent of human beings. Think of one of the most common concepts of what nature is: a realm, a process, a collective being, which adheres to its own inner dynamic of growth and behavior, its own, and not the actions, needs, concerns, desires, greeds, or machinations of humanity. Nature's autonomy has been one of the sources of its spiritual power. But that sense of nature is ended. An altered climate affects every form of life on Earth. Pollution from industrial chemicals pervades bloodstreams and habitats. In 20 years, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Those living beings which suggest wildness in natural parks or nature preserves exist only on our sufferance. An economic need or political change, and they will be crushed like so much of the earth already. Here is a rough, very rough analogy to what any idea of nature spirituality faces now. I would never say that it's easy to be a Christian. Consider, after all, how the Sermon on the Mount directs us to act. Yet I think it's clear that it's a lot easier to be a Christian on Sunday afternoon, after Jesus comes back to life, and then later in the week when he invites everyone to breakfast, that's John 21:12, than it is as the sky darkens on Saturday evening and Jesus seems lost forever. As the following days unfold the terrible suffering of the crucifixion, the growing despair that the Messiah has been lost, that we are literally facing the death of God, all these are redeemed. So while Christians may relive the loss of the Son of God each Easter, they get to relive the joy of his literally miraculous return to life. People may experience the emotional drama of loss, but ultimately, we do not really lose. It all works out. I do not think the losses of nature can be so redeemed. We might say, taking a very long view, that the replacement of dinosaurs by mammals was actually a step in the right direction. It's hard to imagine the dinosaurs feeling that way, but the increase in neurological complexity and adaptability might be worth it, especially to the spiritual seekers who are trying to make their peace with the way nature unites birth and death. But we do not now face the slow organic process in which species are replaced with other species and balanced ecosystems evolve to create large-scale, balanced, interconnected wholes. Rather, what we have now is a wholesale destruction which moves not towards greater complexity, but towards simplification. Oceanic life replaced by plastic and large-scale dead zones where nothing can breathe. Coral reefs, which support 25% of ocean species, are bleaching dead white. Poisonous substance, which lasts for dozens, hundreds, thousands of years, continue to be spewed out of the vast industrial machine. Whales and dolphins are driven mad by undersea noise. Wolves are hunted from helicopters. The intricate connections of the rainforest are replaced by grasslands to feed cattle for hamburgers or tree plantations for palm oil. These transformations exhaust the very limited fertility of rainforest soil and lead to barren ground in a handful of years. The evolutionary replacement of a set of species, even one initiated by an asteroid hit, feels different than the annihilation of life by human beings, not least because we know why human beings are doing it. It is a violent and unthinking chain of greed, violence, stupidity, attachment, and willful ignorance. Whatever past excuses might be made for our environmental practices, that industrial development is good for all, that poor people need more, that all this technology makes life better, there's not one of these that has not been refuted a dozen times over. Poor people of the world are being ravaged by climate change. Much of contemporary technology is ill thought out and renders neurologically colonized people stupider and more alienated from nature and each other. The most vulnerable will continue to suffer the most as time goes on, just as they are suffering the most now. Let's be clear. There is a distinction between a spiritual response to the environmental crisis and the transformation, perhaps end of nature's spirituality itself. Spiritually, we can respond to the environmental crisis with the same virtues that we respond to all and any disappointment. We make ourselves aware of what's going on. We accept it, not in the sense of approve or like or find some cosmic reason why it's really okay. It may not be okay at all, but we accept it in the sense of approve, in the sense that we can look at it clearly, without avoidance, without denial, without whining. Just take it for what it is. And then we move through the other virtues: gratitude for the blessings we've had, compassion for the universality of suffering, our own and those, all the rest who suffer from oppression, and much more difficult, compassion for the human beings who out of folly, ignorance, greed, alienation from their own selves, and addiction can't seem to stop. And finally, we move to love, which means to resist destruction in any way we can. More on that. But spirituality, as I've described it here, can help us respond to the environmental crisis, still leaves an open question. Can our encounter with a polluted and diminished nature itself still sustain spiritual virtues? As a beloved book or teacher or practice, meditation, prayer, might be occasions both to express and to enhance our spiritual lives, can we still get that experience from a burning forest, an oil spill covered beach, a springtime in which we notice how few songbirds there are? Is nature's spirituality still possible? Let's begin by asking, could one legitimate response be simply to avoid the obviously polluted places and concentrate on what's left? I live in Massachusetts. I have a small vacation place in Vermont. We've had a little drought, some heavy rains, and there are fewer birds than there used to be. But we've just had spectacular foliage. The forests are pretty much intact. The water doesn't seem polluted. At least you can't see it with the naked eye. What's to prevent someone, me, from simply enjoying and being spiritually inspired by this kind of nature? Well, the first answer might be nothing. There's no reason not to be inspired, comforted, and even enlightened by what's left. It's still spellbinding to hear a stream in the woods, to see the last of the fall flowers, to watch a hawk gliding on the thermals. Yet I suspect for many there remains the lurking sense that something is not right, that a threat to all this beauty lurks around the corner, that what entrances us now may be on its last legs. Along with environmental grief for what's been lost, environmental anxiety is now a widespread global phenomenon, present in less economically developed nations as it is in developed ones. When will the next extreme weather arrive, and what will it do? The question remains, can we take spiritual inspiration from the damaged, the lessened, the polluted, perhaps the doomed? What would that inspiration look like? Tell you the truth, I don't know. I have some ideas, but while sometimes these make sense, sometimes they don't. I know I can always turn to the spiritual virtues, but can I turn to nature to support me, to sustain me in my spiritual life? What have we lost, and what might remain of nature's spirituality? To begin with, we have lost the sense of an enduring, never-ending perfection. Anne Frank's always, it will always be there, is forever gone. What remains of nature is not a reassuring, encompassing totality that will last far, far beyond our own lives. It is rather a delicate and fragile balance. that will probably soon be tipped over. The universe as a whole, of course, is untouched. When I'm talking about nature, I'm talking about life on Earth. If, that is, it's not already ravaged. The clear-cut forest, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, that soup or stew of plastic waste on the ocean surface that is larger by some estimates than the United States, or perhaps only twice the size of Texas. In the face of dire prospects and dismal present realities, there is no certainty in the future and little comfort in the present. In many places, the beauty is gone. The fragility and temporariness of our own lives, our 70 or 80 or 90 years, can no longer be alleviated by confidence that this clear brook, this forest, these whales or foxes will outlast us. Perhaps they will, and perhaps they won't. We cannot know if our children or grandchildren will have a livable world, or at least a world that will support anything much like modern civilization. Our own sense of vulnerability is not lessened by nature, but made more extreme and painful, because nature is itself vulnerable and wounded. Perhaps most painfully, we must grapple with the ways in which our ordinary lives, how we drive and eat, the clothes we wear, our amusements and endless desires, are part of the unfolding disaster. At least the Christians on Saturday night did not feel responsible for what happened to Jesus. But we, reasonably well-off participants in modern industrial, global high-tech capitalism, or whatever system exists in China, we're all part of the problem. What remains of spirituality? What nature spirituality? What form can it take now? To begin, we can still be grateful for beauty that persists, be in awe of the interconnections and marvel at what can be accomplished without ego. In the face of what's dead or dying, we can be, and this is a melancholy spiritual reflection, if ever there was one, we can be grateful that it ever was. That for us or our ancestors, these beings graced the earth, even if our descendants will only know them as images on a screen or page. After all, did the universe guarantee that any of us would know how pine trees smell, or the way hummingbirds hover, their tiny wings a blur, or the magic of a full moon over the ocean? What were we guaranteed when we came into existence? What do we have the right to expect or demand? I would say, precious little. It's enough that it ever was means we begin with gratitude and perhaps end with that as well. Also, we can still feel connected to the life around us, develop an expanded sense of self, like the connections we may feel with family or dear friends or comrades. We can do this even if those lives are threatened, lessened, disabled. In those connections, we sense that we are not alone, and neither are they. In that shared sensibility, the demands of our single, isolated ego can diminish. There is suffering, but there is also connection. It may be asked without certainty, without guarantees, in a world of shared pain and loss, how are we to function? How can we find a modicum of peace? Consider the following: that a dear friend or your mother or sibling, someone you dearly love, is in a hospital and they're not doing well. They might survive, but probably they will die or be rendered highly disabled. What would you do? Would you want to spend all your time in grief and fear about the future, or anxiety about whether this treatment or that treatment should be used? Of course, there would be some of that. But wouldn't you also want to sit by their bedside, hold their hand, sing to them, stroke their hair? Would any part of you be glad, deeply glad, that they have been part of your life? Could you remember that there is no guarantee that you would ever have had this loving person for even 1 minute, not to mention the years you did have? Could you feel grateful for that? So deeply grateful that the rush of gratitude encompasses and in so doing assuages your grief and fear. Could the gratitude soothe your anger at the people who knowingly caused the pollution-induced illness which is afflicting your loved one? And could the gratitude and the love that underlays it help you accept your own complicity in the environmental crisis of which the pollution which is killing or disabling your loved one, is apart. Ultimately, we might say nature spirituality is about connection. Unlike forms of spirituality in which an individual seeks radical acceptance and detachment, think here of the original or Theravada form of Buddhism, nature spirituality is about love. A love that is not sexual or romantic, but one in which the demands of the ego are subsumed by a sense of interconnection, shared identity, and collective fate. It is more like the saint or wisdom figure of Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva, who is said to experience every other person's pleasures and pains as if they were his or her own. It is a love which dissolves the ego, not in the sense that we no longer know our zip code or which phone is ours, but that the obsessive, desperate need for pleasure, success, recognition, and all the rest diminishes. We pour out of ourselves into another, and what returns back is an expanded sense of self, that oceanic feeling in which we are connected to, and thus, in a way, constitute a reality far larger than just what we can see or feel or experience in our own limited minds and bodies. We are not, you might say at this point, defending the rainforest, or looking at the rainforest, or appreciating the rainforest, or mourning the rainforest. We are rather part of the rainforest, defending itself, or at least we are comrades together. But you may ask, how can we be part of that which is damaged, threatened, under assault, poisoned, being made extinct, exploited for power and profit? How do we join with that which we ourselves, just by being part of contemporary society, are assaulting and threatening? How can we show love, experience connection, and expand ourselves into the world around us in these times, under these conditions, knowing both who we are and what is happening in the world? If our love for the natural world, a world which surely includes humanity, is a form of connection, how can our egos be diminished by being connected to that which is under so much threat? The answer is simple: by resistance, by putting our energies, to the extent that we are capable, into defending what's left. How do we do this? First, by finding as much as we can about what's going on, which means we end our avoidance, our denial, our hiding. We take the trouble and endure the difficulty of reading environmental news. It's not easy. It hurts. It requires that we take time to emotionally process the realities, but that we engage in it. After finding out what's going on, we can then find some place or issue or cause that is quite simply on the side of life and sanity and against the forces of needless death and madness. The place might be a lake or a forest. The issue might be chemical pollution or the theft of local water supplies by Coca-Cola factories in India. The lives at stake might be endangered birds or endangered people of color subjected to environmental racism. We join with life by seeking to defend it against exploitation, violence, and thoughtlessness. As I just said, this idea is quite simple. Just resist. That's how you join. The execution, of course, is extremely complicated and often terribly hard. But as with Christianity, one can say many things about spirituality in general and nature spirituality in particular, but one cannot say with any degree of understanding that it's easy. At this point, someone might well complain, "Really, Professor Gottlieb? This is the best you've got? Where's the hope? Where's the reassurance? I thought spirituality was supposed to make me feel better. You've just depressed the hell out of me." To which I'll willingly reply, I am sorry that this is the world in which we live. I deeply wish it were otherwise. In concentration camps, in war zones, in places of violence and oppression, there isn't much reassurance to be found. And often there is little to no hope as well. What there is or at least what there can be, is courage. And as we face the global environmental crisis, this is, I believe, what we need most of all. That and the faith that life makes more sense if we face the truth and deal with reality as it actually is, rather than hide, deny, avoid, hide, deny, avoid, and distract. We cannot suppress the knowledge of something, cannot avoid it, unless we know where it is. So the choice is between a life of hiding from reality, our mood permanently darkened by the suppressed knowledge of what the present holds and the future threatens, and a life where we discover within ourselves the courage to embrace reality for what it is, and to embrace it in gratitude, in compassion, and in love, and therefore, in resistance.